January 21st, 1968. Before sunrise, the Marines at Khe Sanh heard the first incoming rounds. Then the entire base seemed to erupt. North Vietnamese rockets, mortars, and artillery slammed into the American position. One round struck the main ammunition dump. Seconds later, thousands of artillery shells and other munitions began exploding. Fire rolled across the base. Black smoke climbed into the sky. Secondary explosions continued for hours. Marines ran for bunkers while pieces of burning ammunition crashed around them. And outside the perimeter, a much larger North Vietnamese force was closing in. Khe Sanh was isolated. The road to the east was effectively closed. The airstrip was under fire. The surrounding hills were contested. And nearly everything the defenders needed to survive now had to come through the air. For Washington, there was an even more frightening thought. 14 years earlier, another Western army had occupied another isolated base in Vietnam. The French called it Dien. They never escaped. Now President Lyndon Johnson wanted to know whether the United States was about to suffer the same disaster. For the next 77 days, thousands of American troops would live under artillery fire, sleep underground, fight for the surrounding hills, and depend on aircraft flying into one of the most dangerous airfields in Vietnam. America had overwhelming firepower. But at Khe Sanh, firepower alone was not enough. To understand why the position became so dangerous, you first have to understand where it was. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat in the mountains of northwestern South Vietnam. Laos was only a few miles away. The demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam lay to the north. This was not the Vietnam of rice paddies, crowded villages, and flat farmland. Khe Sanh was surrounded by jungle-covered mountains, valleys, and steep hills. It was remote even by the standards of the Vietnam War, and that location was exactly why the Americans valued it. From Khe Sanh, U.S. forces could observe movement near the Laotian border and threaten routes connected to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The base also sat near important approaches into northern South Vietnam. But the location created a dangerous contradiction. The farther Khe Sanh was from the populated coastal areas, the more difficult it was to support. There was essentially one major ground connection, Route 9. By 1968, that road was no longer a reliable supply route. North Vietnamese forces could ambush traffic, mine the road, and dominate sections of the surrounding terrain. That left the Americans increasingly dependent on aircraft. If Khe Sanh needed ammunition, it came by air. If it needed food, it came by air. If it needed fuel, it came by air. If wounded Marines had to be evacuated, aircraft had to get them out. The base could survive without Route 9, but only as long as the sky remained open, and the North Vietnamese understood that. There was another weakness. The main combat base sat below a series of important hills. Hill 861, Hill 881 South, Hill 881 North, and other high ground around the plateau. Whoever controlled those hills could observe movement and influence the battle below. The Marines had already learned how important they were. In 1967, months before the famous siege, American and North Vietnamese forces fought brutally for the high ground around Khe Sanh. The fighting was close. The terrain was terrible, and Marine casualties were heavy. By early 1968, there was little doubt that something larger was developing. North Vietnamese regulars were moving into the region. American intelligence watched the build-up. More Marines were sent to Khe Sanh. Bunkers were reinforced. Artillery ammunition was stockpiled. The defenders prepared for an attack. General William Westmoreland believed the enemy might be preparing for a major battle, and unlike some commanders who feared being trapped there, Westmoreland saw an opportunity. If the North Vietnamese army concentrated large formations around Khe Sanh, American aircraft and artillery could destroy them. In other words, Westmoreland believed the enemy might be walking into a killing zone. But there was a problem with that idea. The Marines had to remain inside the killing zone too. Then came January 21st. The opening bombardment immediately exposed just how vulnerable the base was. North Vietnamese gunners hit the main ammunition storage area. Nearly 11,000 rounds of ammunition were destroyed. Explosions continued for almost 2 days. Yet something important happened. The American supply system reacted. Aircraft brought in replacement ammunition. The shortage did not become catastrophic. Khe Sanh did not begin its siege with Marines counting their final bullets. But the attack proved that the enemy could strike deep inside the base, and the bombardment continued. North Vietnamese artillerymen had one major advantage. Some of their guns could fire from positions difficult for American artillery to reach. They used mountains, jungle, camouflage, and prepared positions to hide. A gun could fire. The crew could disappear. Then another battery could open up somewhere else. The Marines fired back. American aircraft hunted suspected positions. But stopping every gun was impossible. Inside Khe Sanh, normal life changed. Men learned that open ground was dangerous. A Marine walking from one bunker to another could suddenly hear the warning. Incoming! There might be only seconds to react. Artillery could strike the runway. It could hit a bunker. It could hit an aircraft. It could hit a fuel area. It could hit men standing in line for food. There was no rear area. The entire base was within the battle. And every day brought the same question. Was the artillery only another bombardment? Or was it preparing the way for the assault everyone expected? The fear was not imaginary. North Vietnamese forces had massed around Khe Sanh. Marine positions on the surrounding hills were attacked. Trenches and fighting positions appeared closer to American defenses. Intelligence reported enemy movement. At night, the defenders watched the darkness beyond the wire. They knew what a full-scale attack could look like. Thousands of soldiers moving behind artillery, sappers cutting through obstacles, mortars hitting defensive positions, machine guns covering assault troops. If enough North Vietnamese forces broke through one section of the perimeter, Khe Sanh could become a close-range battle where much of America's advantage in air power would be harder to use. Then another event made the situation even more frightening. On February 7th, North Vietnamese troops attacked the Special Forces camp at Lang Vei, southwest of Khe Sanh. This time they brought tanks. Soviet-built PT-76 rolled through the defensive wire. It was the first time North Vietnamese armor had been used in South Vietnam. The camp was overrun. For the men at Khe Sanh, the message was unmistakable. The enemy surrounding them did not have only infantry and artillery. Now they knew tanks were in the area, and Lang Vei proved that a fortified position could fall. Imagine being 20 years old and sitting inside a bunker after hearing that news. The road behind you is closed. Thousands of enemy soldiers are somewhere outside your perimeter. Their artillery can reach you. Their tanks have just destroyed another nearby position, and nobody can tell you exactly when the main attack will come. That psychological pressure became one of the defining experiences of Khe Sanh. But the North Vietnamese faced their own problem. Every time they concentrated troops, vehicles, ammunition, or artillery positions around the base, they risked exposing themselves to one of the most powerful collections of firepower ever brought into a battle in Vietnam. The American response was Operation Niagara. The name was appropriate. The United States intended to pour fire around Khe Sanh. Marine aircraft joined Navy and Air Force aircraft. Artillery batteries fired around the clock. Fighter bombers attacked suspected enemy positions. And B-52 stratofortresses struck areas where intelligence indicated North Vietnamese forces were gathering. The Marines on the ground often never saw the B-52s. The bombers operated high above them. Then the earth in the distance would erupt. For North Vietnamese troops trying to move through the hills around Khe Sanh, American air power could be devastating. Sensors added another dimension. Electronic devices were used to detect movement in areas the Americans could not easily observe. A movement pattern could become a set of coordinates. Those coordinates could bring artillery, or fighters, or B-52s. The battlefield around Khe Sanh became a contest between concealment and detection. The North Vietnamese used jungle, trenches, caves, bunkers, camouflage, and darkness. The Americans used aircraft, sensors, artillery, reconnaissance, and enormous quantities of explosives. Westmoreland believed this was precisely the kind of battle American forces could win. The enemy was concentrating. America had the firepower to punish concentration. But once again, there was a catch. Air power could devastate enemy forces outside the perimeter. It could not replace everything happening on the ground. The Marines still had to hold the hills. They still had to guard the wire. They still had to keep the artillery firing. And most importantly, the base still had to be supplied. That became a battle of its own. Landing at Khe Sanh could be terrifying. Transport aircraft approached a runway that enemy observers could watch and enemy guns could target. A slow aircraft sitting on the ground was extremely vulnerable. Pilots could not simply land, park, and wait while cargo was calmly unloaded. Everything had to happen fast. Men rushed toward aircraft. Cargo came off. Wounded men went aboard. Engines stayed running. Then the aircraft got back into the air. Sometimes enemy fire made normal landings too dangerous. The Americans adapted. C-130 transport crews used specialized methods to deliver cargo without spending unnecessary time exposed on the runway. Supplies could be dropped by parachute. Other loads could be extracted from aircraft flying extremely low over the airfield. Helicopters carried supplies to isolated hill positions. Every method carried risk, but together they kept Khe Sanh alive. And then there was the weather. Fog, clouds, rain, low visibility. These were not minor inconveniences. At Khe Sanh, bad weather could become a tactical weapon for the enemy. When clouds covered the mountains, pilots had greater difficulty finding targets. Helicopters became more vulnerable. Transport operations became harder. Close air support could be delayed or restricted. The Americans possessed enormous air power, but they could not bomb through a mountain they could not see. For the Marines waiting below, weather could determine whether aircraft arrived when they were needed most. This is where the comparison with Dien Bien Phu became so frightening. The French had also occupied an isolated position. They had also depended heavily on aircraft. Vietnamese forces had surrounded them. Artillery had made their airfield increasingly dangerous. The French supply system had deteriorated. Their defensive positions had been reduced one by one. Eventually, the garrison collapsed. American leaders knew the story. President Johnson reportedly followed Khe Sanh with extraordinary attention. He did not want photographs of captured American Marines becoming the symbol of his war. But Khe Sanh was not Dien Bien Phu. The differences were enormous. The Americans had far greater air power. They had B-52s. They had helicopters. They had much greater transport capacity. They had sophisticated artillery support. They had electronic sensors. And most importantly, their logistics system kept functioning. That was the decisive difference. Khe Sanh was dangerous not because the base had already collapsed, It was dangerous because so many things had to keep working to prevent collapse. The high ground had to remain in American hands. The artillery had to keep firing. The air supply system had to remain open. Aircraft had to continue reaching the base. The defenders had to survive constant bombardment, and North Vietnamese troops had to be prevented from massing for a decisive breakthrough. If one part failed, the Americans could compensate. If several failed together, the situation could change very quickly. And then, while Washington watched Khe Sanh, the entire war exploded. At the end of January 1968, Communist forces launched the Tet Offensive. Attacks struck cities and military installations across South Vietnam. Saigon was hit. Hue became the scene of savage urban combat. Suddenly, American commanders were fighting major battles far beyond Khe Sanh. This created one of the enduring mysteries of the battle. What exactly was North Vietnam trying to achieve at Khe Sanh? Was the goal to destroy the Marine garrison and create another Dien Bien Phu? Was Khe Sanh partly designed to pull American troops and attention toward the remote northwest while attacks were prepared elsewhere? Or did the operation serve several purposes at once? Even official American histories have treated the question cautiously. There is no simple answer. What is clear is that Khe Sanh consumed enormous American attention. Washington watched it. Westmoreland watched it. Aircraft and artillery were concentrated around it. And while that happened, Tet erupted across the country. Still, on the battlefield at Khe Sanh, the North Vietnamese never achieved the breakthrough the Americans feared. The Marines held the critical positions. The air bridge survived. American artillery continued firing. Airstrikes continued. North Vietnamese forces could shell the base, attack outposts, and maintain enormous psychological pressure. But they could not destroy the entire defensive system. By March, the balance began to shift. The weather improved. American commanders prepared an operation to end Khe Sanh's isolation. It was called Operation Pegasus. The 1st Cavalry Division would play a major role. So would Marines and South Vietnamese forces. Engineers would reopen Route 9. Artillery bases would move forward, and helicopters would allow troops to leap across terrain that would have slowed a traditional ground advance. Pegasus began on April 1st. The operation combined ground movement with airmobile warfare. Helicopters carried troops onto key positions. Artillery followed. Engineers worked on Route 9. Marine forces pushed outward. The North Vietnamese fought back in several areas, but they could not stop the advance. On April 5th, Allied forces reached Khe Sanh. Route 9 was reopened. The isolation was ending. The nightmare America had feared had not happened. There would be no American Dien Bien Phu, no mass surrender, no captured Marine regiment, no destroyed garrison. From the American military perspective, Khe Sanh had held. But the story did not end there. And what happened next made Khe Sanh one of the most controversial battles of the Vietnam War. Only a few months later, the Americans abandoned the combat base. Bunkers were destroyed. Equipment was removed. Positions that Marines had fought and died to defend were left behind. To anyone watching from outside the military, the obvious question was unavoidable. If Khe Sanh had been so important in January, why leave it in July? The answer was that American strategy had changed. Marine commanders were shifting away from tying large forces to a fixed position in the remote mountains. The base had served a purpose during the siege, but keeping thousands of troops permanently committed there no longer made sense. Militarily, abandoning Khe Sanh after successfully defending it did not mean the siege had been lost. But politically, the image was much harder to explain. The United States had told the world Khe Sanh would be held. The Marines had endured more than 2 months of bombardment to hold it. American aircraft had dropped enormous amounts of ordnance around it. Then the United States left. North Vietnam could claim that American forces had ultimately been forced from the position. America could claim that the enemy had failed to capture it and that US forces had left on their own terms. Both sides could point to facts that supported their version. That is why asking who won Khe Sanh produces an incomplete answer. On the battlefield, the North Vietnamese army did not destroy the Marine garrison. The feared collapse never occurred. American air power, artillery, logistics, and infantry held the position until ground contact was restored. But Khe Sanh also demonstrated something deeper about the Vietnam War. The United States could dominate a battlefield without necessarily solving the larger strategic problem. It could keep an isolated base alive almost entirely through the air. It could strike enemy concentrations with B-52s. It could move artillery shells, fuel, food, and wounded men through hostile fire. It could defend mountain positions against a larger surrounding force. Few militaries in the world could have done what American forces did at Khe Sanh, but the question remained. Why were they there? What did holding that ground accomplish? And was the price worth it? Those questions followed the United States throughout Vietnam. Khe Sanh became a perfect example of the contradiction. Tactically, American power was extraordinary. Strategically, victory could be difficult to define. And politically, even a battlefield success could become part of a much larger crisis. The Tet Offensive did not destroy the American military in Vietnam. Communist forces suffered devastating losses in many of the attacks. But Tet changed how millions of Americans understood the war. The public had repeatedly been told that progress was being made. Then television screens filled with images of fighting in Saigon, Hue, and Khe Sanh. The gap between military statistics and public perception became impossible to ignore. That is the larger reason Khe Sanh matters. America did not nearly lose the base because its Marines were weak. The opposite is true. The defenders held under extraordinary pressure. America did not nearly lose because its supply system failed. The supply system was one of the reasons the base survived. And America did not nearly lose because its air power was ineffective. Air power was essential. The danger came from dependence. Khe Sanh depended on an interconnected system: air supply, artillery, hill defenses, intelligence, weather, aircraft availability, ground troops. Lose one piece and the others could compensate. Lose several at the wrong moment, and thousands of Americans might suddenly find themselves trapped in a shrinking perimeter with no safe road out. That was the real nightmare. For 77 days the system held. Aircraft kept coming. Artillery kept firing. Marines kept holding the hills. And the North Vietnamese never achieved the decisive assault that could have turned Khe Sanh into America's Dien Bien Phu. But the men inside those bunkers did not know that. They did not know how the battle would end. They did not know whether the next barrage was routine harassment or the beginning of the final attack. They did not know whether the next aircraft would make it through the fog and enemy fire. They did not know whether enemy tanks would appear beyond the wire. They knew only what they could see: smoke, mud, trenches, explosions, the hills around them, and an enemy somewhere beyond the perimeter. That uncertainty is what made Khe Sanh terrifying. America had more aircraft, more artillery, more technology, more logistical power. Yet for more than 2 months, thousands of Marines remained in a position where a combination of bad weather, enemy artillery, lost high ground, and a major ground assault could have created a disaster. It never happened. Khe Sanh held. But it held because almost every part of the American war machine was forced to work together to keep it alive. And that may be the real story of Khe Sanh. Not how America lost another Dien Bien Phu, but how close it came to creating the conditions for one, and how much firepower it took to make sure history did not repeat itself.